good to see so many people. Before we get into the interview, I'm just gonna spend a few minutes talking about myself so everybody knows who I am and where I come from and why I think I'm sitting here to do this interview. About a bit more than 10 years ago, I was finally completely fed up with homophobia, and so I got together with a group of friends who were also tired of what we called the straight world order, and we organized in a revolutionary militant underground group and considered ourselves a part of the queer movement. And we taught self-defense to queer kids, and we painted graffiti, and we did all kinds of stuff. And basically we wanted to just run into the straight world order and put things on fire. We were just angry, and then so we were part of the queer movement, and 2 years into this project that lasted for 8 years all in all, 2 years into this project, one of the co-founders, Trine Munk, came up to me and said, I've heard that there's something called queer theory and feminist theory. It's something they do at the university, and we had no idea. And so we started studying queer theory and feminist theory a little bit. And what I experienced was that we had the anger before, we had the political involvement, and we had the motivation. But once we got some of the theory and started to understand some of that, we also got depth and strength and arguments. And we got a better understanding of the political situation that we were angry about. So a lot of the theoretical work and the queer academia, you could say, was like gasoline to that fire. So today we have two people who have been teaching some of these things since before I was born. So I'm very, very privileged and honored and happy to be able to sit here and talk with them for the next hour. So today I'm giving lectures about this stuff, and I'm writing about it, and we've also recently started a radio program, a monthly podcast. But you can find more about me over there. There's some flyers if you are interested in it. So enough about me. So Anne and Julie are both gender researchers, and Fausto-Sterling, you're also a biologist, and Julie Nielsen, you're an economist. So we're gonna hear a little bit about what you've been working with. Let's start with you, Julie. So you have been part of a group of people who invented something called feminist economy in the 90s.
Correct.
And I know this is a bit unfair question, but because you've been working with it for a long time, so you can probably talk about it for a really long time. But I would like you to just very briefly tell me what's the main question that you've been asking these years. Like, what is the main thing that you've been trying to investigate, and what did you find out?
The main thing that I've been working on is the way the discipline of economics itself and the way we think about the economy got shaped by beliefs about gender. When I started working in economics, actually thinking about there being two genders was an improvement over what was there before, because it was assumed that there's just one human experience, and that's male experience. And that's how we think, and that's how the economy works. And yeah, there are these other people, women, but they don't do anything interesting. So as economists, we don't need to pay any attention.
But what's the problem
so getting
with that in economy? Inside economy?
What it does is, for example, there's a total neglect of everything that women traditionally did in households. So that if women left what they had been traditionally doing at home and went out and got jobs, that just added to productivity. There's no accounting for any lost thing that had been done before. So there is no kind of accounting for the general welfare of people. Only what had been done in a masculine marketed way would get counted. So you have these certain biases built in about what actually contributes to human welfare. And then some of my more nerdish things, I guess, have to do with how economists go about their studies. That there's a big elevation of quantitative research, no respect at all for more qualitative research. these kinds of things, which fit into a gender binary. And I don't think the answer is to flip over to the other side and say math is evil, we have to do qualitative. But either way, we're hobbling ourselves and only using half of what we could be using to investigate the world if we buy into that binary.
Okay. So again, like, why is this important? I mean, it's like, what's the idea about going into this research? You talked a little bit about how you completely neglect that women are doing some kind of work that's outside of the work market.
Right.
But why is it important to broaden the perspective? What does it give us?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. A lot of people working in feminist economics work on things like labor market discrimination, which was assumed to not exist until feminist economists started looking into it more. In my own case, I'm more interested in things like why we think of the economy and commerce as a realm where it's okay to be not only self-interested and rational, but even opportunistic, that is even expected of people working in business. Whereas we tend to still think of families as areas of more care and interrelations. Well, obviously families can also be spheres of domestic violence. We should not romanticize the local and familial in that case. And I think that we have lost an older idea of the area of commerce and business as an area of also care and responsibility. That we have, by thinking of it as this kind of mechanical, mathematical realm that sides with masculine self-interest and rationality, not with interpersonal relations. We have severely hampered how we think about the way the world of money and markets actually works.
So traditionally, masculine and feminine qualities like self-interest or profit maximization and care and interpersonal relations exist in both private realms and workplaces.
I think they actually exist in both realms, but we've gotten in the habit of thinking about them along this gender binary that bifurcates and says, home is about care, workplace is about self-interest, and we can't expect anything more of the workplace. And if there's violence going on at the home, we tend to kind of ignore that because that's not supposed to be happening. That's the realm of care. Okay,
and so you think both realms might actually benefit from opening up the perspectives to let more perspectives into both?
We have had blinders put on by thinking in that binary.
Good. We're going to go more into that. I brought some cases and some claims that we're going to discuss afterwards, so we can get more into the theories on a more practical level with some examples. And you have been working in biology and with gender also for many years. So I'm going to ask you the same unfair question. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the main question that you've been working on? What have you been trying to investigate through all of this career?
Well, I think first of all that's changed a little bit with time as the sort of political circumstances change. But I got involved in some of the things that I've been doing first in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when as an activist myself in the feminist movement. And one of the things that we encountered as feminists who were arguing for greater political participation, for economic rights, pointing out things like that women's work in the home has value but it's unpaid, all of these kinds of things that were part of the second wave of feminism. One of the responses we heard, one of the oppositional responses we would hear regularly, was couched in arguments about biology, that women couldn't do certain work because they weren't strong enough, or they weren't smart enough, or they weren't aggressive enough, and they couldn't become politicians because they weren't trustworthy. A very famous example was the personal physician of a man named Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president of the U.S. at that point, and this was shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which the U.S. invaded Cuba, and we almost, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we almost had a World War III with Kennedy versus Khrushchev, sort of like this, almost deciding to drop nuclear bombs. That what he said is that if there'd been a woman as president who was then, by implication because of her age, she would have been postmenopausal or possibly menopausal, that she wouldn't have had the emotional stability to face Khrushchev and make him back down. So I was hearing arguments like that. I heard arguments often about aggressiveness, and that men get ahead because they're more aggressive. And I was a young biologist at that point. I was just starting my career. I had just completed my PhD, and I worked on fruit flies. I didn't know much about and people would get up in meetings and cite these experiments on testosterone and aggression in rats. And I was like, people turned to me and said, well, you're a biologist, is that true? And I was like, I don't know. So the first intervention, if you will, that I made was to write a book called Myths of Gender, in which I looked at each of these myths, the main myths about, as I came to conclude they were, about biological theories. So the subtitle is Biological Theories About Women and Men. And I looked at each of these in some detail, using my skills as a biologist to analyze the work, see what I thought of it, explain to a bigger audience just what the work was, and more importantly, what it wasn't, because it was pretty much lacking in every area. But doing that book raised bigger questions for me, because what was astounding to me was to see that the authors of this work were the major biologists of their period, whether you started with Charles Darwin, who was not a minor biologist, and you came up through the people who founded the field of psychology in the United States, names that, well, most of you probably don't even use dictionaries anymore, but names like Thorndike, who was the author of a dictionary we all grew up with. But all of these were the best scientists of their time, whatever time it was, and they received rewards for doing this work that when my contemporary, my colleagues, other biologists looked at now, they would say, "Oh, that's just bad science." And I was like, "Yeah, it's bad, but it was done by the best scientists of the time." So I left that book needing to understand how that could be. That is, how could science, which was supposed to be objective and have no point of view, have such a strong point of view, and not just for one decade, but for hundreds of years? And how could the people working in it, the best minds of the time, have that strong point of view and yet not even know it, and maybe even actively deny it? So the next work that I did, which culminated in 2000 with the second book, was to try to understand how science works better, and how, as I came to ask the question, how does culture become a part of science? In this case, the culture of sexism. How has it become part of the fabric of science without people even knowing it? And to that I turned to a different intellectual movement called Science and Technology Studies, which I'm still very actively engaged in. And then I wrote this second book, Sexing the Body, Biology and the Social Construction of Gender, in which I tried to take apart how knowledge about gender actually becomes folded into what looks like objective knowledge. So that book represented a shift in what I did. But then came out in 2000. I sort of grew weary of what I consider just oppositional work. So it continued to be, someone would publish a paper saying there were gay brains, or that male gay brains looked more like women's brains. And then I would be called upon to both explain it and criticize it. And then some of the material I'd already criticized in Myths of Gender, it reemerged in a slightly different form. And I basically grew tired of always being reactive. And so at that point I made another shift to say, well, how else can we have a conversation about sex and gender and also race? How else can we have that conversation without getting into this language of its nature or its nurture, its biology or its culture? How else can we understand how bodies come into being and how they acquire what we think of as gender? How do they become racialized? And for that, I turned to the work that I am now doing, which is, in a way, a turn back towards empirical work, but trying to use something, a dynamic approach to human development to understand how we become who we are, starting from actually before birth and as we go through the entire life cycle. So that's where I am now.
Perfect. So you could say, I mean, when you look at the world and you see so-called men and women, we see patterns. We see like long hair, short hair, and like different jobs and different hobbies, etc.
Right.
So you're basically trying to find out how these patterns are created.
Yes.
Also, right? Yeah, and also what they mean and what consequences they have. And so the nature versus nurture is what in Danish is called our milieu. It's like, is there some essence in the biology that will manifest itself no matter what, or our behavioral patterns based on gender, are they imposed on us from the culture, outside culture in some way? And so your take on that is that it's a dynamic, it's a dialogue. So
yeah, it's a dynamic, and I think they aren't separable. So within science, the way people usually try to look at this question is to say, well, we can bracket one and study the other, and then we can add in the one back to the other. And what I'm arguing is that the one that culture actually changes nature, and vice versa.
So the biology, so the brain, for example, can be changed by the culture.
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
How is that?
Well, again, this is now quite well established neuroscience. This is not. It's not surprising to neuroscientists, but it's something surprisingly that, say, psychologists forget to think about. So when an infant is born, they have, relatively speaking, very few interconnections in their neurons, but they don't so much grow new nerve cells as they do grow an interconnectivity, so that both the branching of each nerve cell that can transmit electrical impulses or can transmit sensory impulses increases, and then the interpenetration, if you will, of all of the nerve cells grows enormously in the first few months of development, and especially through the first 5 years of life, so that you start with something that looks like a kind of set of little bushes that are almost dead and have no leaves at the beginning, and then by the end of the 5 years, you have this enormous growth. So there's a huge increase in brain size in this time, and a huge increase in complexity. And what's very clear now from all sorts of studies is that that complexity, that increase in complexity, is what neuroscientists call experience dependent. So if you think of a baby, it's like a little sensory sponge. It's hearing and it's seeing and it's experiencing touch. It's experiencing heat and cold for the first time. It's experiencing smell. All of the things that we call the five senses are like a constant input into the little baby. If and this happens occasionally, like in a very severe orphanage or something, you have an infant who's sensorially deprived. They don't get that input, that experience. Their brain doesn't develop properly. And it's very clear that all of this development is part of input. So the idea that you're born with a fixed brain is, no one who's a serious neuroscientist thinks that. And so the question is, for me, what are all of these sensory inputs, sound, touch, smell, sight, what are they doing? How are they shaping the brain? And also the things like the muscular development and the responses of the extremities to brain signals. How are they shaping the brain from the very beginning? Because they're shaping behavior as the infant grows.
Okay, so I've been trying to ask the question often, is there a difference between men and women? Because that seems to be one of the myths, that there is a biological difference and it will manifest itself no matter what. And yesterday we talked about the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Yeah.
And I don't know whoever, if anyone read it. I read it. It's fun and really stupid. Sorry, like John Gray, if you're hearing this.
We agree.
Sorry, but it is. Basically, what it argues is that there is this difference between men and women, and it will manifest itself no matter what. And men and women are so different from nature that they can't even communicate and form good relationships in any way. So everybody should become gay, I guess. But
Right.
But so and as you say, like we know it's not like that. So my question is, why do you, Julie? Maybe you want to start. Like, why do people want to believe this story? Why do people buy into this story?
Well, I'll put on a sort of a larger social science hat. Economists recently have started looking at how humans actually behave instead of how they logically would behave in a formal model. So an area called behavioral economics has come up, which includes some aspects of psychology. And my more recent work in relation to that is looking at what our beliefs about gender versus what we actually do in choosing and enacting our own sorts of gender roles. And it turns out that a sort of a binary belief about what's masculine and what's feminine is important in sort of structuring our brains, but it's something that we essentially make up in our brains rather than essences that are out there. But it's very important how we sort things. I've used examples like cats and dogs. Do people have a gender association? Generally in European American culture, dogs are considered more masculine. We can get even more abstract, odd and even numbers. Odd numbers are sometimes considered more masculine, even more feminine. Pythagoreans thought odd were more masculine because they could not be penetrated by the number 2. So our brains actually use this binary. But while there is, and some psychological studies have looked at this, there tends to be a lot of agreement within a culture on what a stereotypical man is and what a stereotypical woman is. Then if you start asking people, well, what are you? We get what psychologists call mosaicism. A mosaic is not one big hunk of tile, it's a bunch of different colored tiles. So if you're a man and you like art and music, well, you've already picked a couple things out of that feminine pile. If you're a woman and you might be, heterosexual, straight, everything else, but if you like football or you like controlling your own money, you started picking things out of that other pile. So what we actually are, and I think we can, extend this onto sexual preference and sexual identity, that might not agree with biological identity. We actually pick and choose and put together a lot of these things. So then if you look at things like actual behavior, and economists have gotten interested in things like risk aversion, competition, altruism, some of these sorts of things. And people also know about supposed differences in verbal abilities, that women are more verbal, men are more mathematical, all of that kind of stuff. Often we tend to think about it in this Mars versus Venus ways, that men are this and women are that. What I actually find in looking at the evidence, the data on this from people's actual behavior, drawing from all of these things, and people's behavior also changes over time. Just because you choose one mosaic one year doesn't mean 10 years later you're going to be doing the same thing. But we actually find when you look at the data, and the metaphor that we should oppose to the Mars versus Venus, and this is a US-based one, you can create your own Danish one, is men are from North Dakota, women are from South Dakota. Those are two neighboring states in the US. Yes, there are some differences that are detectable, but they are not this wild species difference behavior. There's just a whole lot of overlap. When we talk about gender difference, we should talk about gender difference and similarity. Yes, there are some differences on average in behaviors, but there's also just an enormous amount of overlap and similarity, and that gets lost in that Mars versus Venus.
But then I think something that you've both been working on a lot is that as long as people buy into these assumptions and myths and stereotypes, it's difficult to change the actual important things like the economy, for example, that you've been working on, or the science. But so again, so in order for things to change, maybe we need to try and understand why people want to. It seems that people are really eager to believe this system. Have you thought about this? Why is that?
There's I can think of two possible, two reasons that should both be considered. One is there are issues of power, and it's in the interest of some people in power to maintain power. And so if you get some advantages from believing that men are more competent in the workplace, then you probably want to continue to spread that belief around. So we should not neglect the power aspect. However, you can also get, I think, other cases of sort of psychological buy-in just from the fact that it's so clear and so easy to think that way. That you can get a certain kind of confidence, even if the confidence is, oh, I'm a woman, I don't have to be financially responsible because somebody else should take care of me. I find that to be a horrible sort of attitude, but you have to admit it could have some appeal if you don't want to take on that kind of responsibility for yourself. So that there can be certain kinds of buy-in to these dichotomies, that there's something that feels safe and secure, even about fairly oppressive situations, just because they're familiar.
So I need to say that things have changed a huge amount certainly since the late 1960s New Wave feminism. There have been huge changes, and they've become part of the legal system. I mean, as a result of New Wave feminism, there are, discrimination is officially illegal. In theory, we still haven't achieved it, but women are entitled to the same pay for the same work. That's now in the law. A whole series of legal changes around questions of violence against women have occurred. And there are all sorts of rules about sexual harassment in the workplace that didn't exist in 1970. The laws around rape and sexual violence have changed. There's a whole infrastructure, particularly around violence against women, that didn't exist before. There are women's shelters. There's counseling. There are people who are expert in talking about these. Those didn't exist. None of that existed in 1970, and so that change has come because of political activism, and it kind of didn't matter whether people sort of thinking abstractly about men and women thought they were different. What happened was you had a mass movement that changed the laws, and then people's minds changed along with them a lot. I mean, it's not that this kind of attitude is gone altogether, but I also think that the idea that deeply embedded culture changes easily is a false idea. I mean, I think one of the things that's clear is that deeply embedded cultural ideas take generations to change. So I think the time scale that, as a young feminist, I had in mind was completely off. So, 10 years it would all be solved, but no, it's going to be more like 5 generations. But in that time, the change is incremental, and you can really see it. So I think I think that we have to remember, as we worry about resistance to change, that there also has been a lot of change.
When I started getting involved in fighting hate crimes, I gave myself 6 months, and then I said in 6 months there wouldn't be any more hate crimes. Right. I also thought that was unrealistic later. But it's good. This definitely leads me on to the next question, because sometimes when we're talking about many different political struggles, but especially in gay rights struggles, I've heard this a lot. People use the phrase, "We're almost there." We've come a long way. We still got a way to go, but we're almost there. And I think this is interesting because there's a small anecdote to this, because I read an article recently about Hollywood catastrophe movies, like 2012, A Planet of the Apes, all this. And they all have the same plot. It's like humanity starts, a human culture, and then everything is messed up, and then the world almost ends, but then one white heterosexual man from the US saves the world and the planet. And he's usually also divorced or single, and then also finds a woman at the end of the movie. So he also saves the straight world order. And in this article, the point was that the funny thing is that it's this individualistic, Western, patriarchal way of life that has led to capitalism and consumerism, and basically messed up the whole world to begin with. So this is counterproductive. He's just gonna repeat the whole circle again. And if you want to basically save the world, you need feminism, collectivism, ecological ways of life, etc. And the funny thing is that this narrative in these Hollywood catastrophe movie is the same linear thinking as the "we're almost there" phrase, I think. So my question is, what do you think of this, and will we get there, and what will it be like there, and how long how long can we stay there, and where will we go afterwards? Do you want to start there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and of course I don't have an answer, especially about what the future will be like. I guess I think there'll continue to be incremental improvement, but it won't necessarily be all unidirectional. That is, I think there'll be, in the United States right now, we're in a period of tremendous reaction against all the change and pushback. And there are areas where ground is being lost that I could never have imagined
What could that be
again.
like?
Well, for example, there's now a vocal, high up political movement against birth control. Well, birth control was something women won in the 20s, and you thought, well, we'll never go back. And I think we won't go back, but the fact that there's even now a space where people can get public attention to argue that birth control is a bad thing. So there's a tremendous pushback against women's clinics, healthcare for women, and it's all under the guise of anti-abortion, but it's much more than anti-abortion. So suddenly we're relitigating battles that we thought were done. And I don't think we'll go back to an era where birth control is illegal, which it was when I was a young woman. But the fact that it's even on the table again is astounding to me. So that's the kind of pushback, and then you got to push back again. But so I think it's, one step backwards, two steps forward kind of thing. Which partly is I could not have predicted this, what I consider a pretty dark political period in the United States, sort of looking ahead from the 1960s and 1970s. I could not have predicted this kind of pushback. Which makes me very wary of making predictions, because I think there are forces, large social forces that I certainly don't understand well enough to know when they're going to come rising out and go, enough. So I just have to keep, thinking, well, we'll keep pushing for what we think the progressive things are, and there's a lot of unknowns out there. So if we look at something like climate change, maybe, I think even this, we both live in the Northeast. She's in Boston, I'm just south of Boston. We had a very difficult winter, huge amounts of snow. The infrastructure kind of ground to a halt. The public transportation system in Boston just collapsed. It couldn't work with, and it collapsed not so much because there was so much snow as because it hadn't been invested in for 30 years, and all the equipment was literally 30 years old and had never been replaced. They had to let prisoners out of prison in order to hand shovel the snow off of the train tracks in order to get the trains moving. That is an event of weather, but it got people's attention, including some politicians who are maybe starting to say, maybe we should do something about climate change. This was the worst winter in Boston on record, which is maybe, records have been kept for what, a century?
Since 1872.
Since 1872. So that's in a way a random event that completely out of our control. We don't control how much it snows, but it's a kind of thing that can get people's attention, politicians' attention, and along with a movement of people start to maybe make a change. So I think predicting the path of political change is extremely difficult, because it's not just a whole lot of people of goodwill pushing and then you get somewhere, but it's that plus a bunch of other things that you have no control over. Someone gets assassinated. I mean, look, there are just things you can't necessarily control, where something will explode. The events in Missouri this summer, where this young man was shot and killed by police, exploded into an entire mass movement, which is still going on. The Ferguson, yeah. So there are things that happen in political change that are not predictable, both for good and for bad.
Julie, what do you think there will be some kind of almost like a post-revolutionary society where we can just say, okay, now it's done, we can just sit back and enjoy?
No, you said, when are we going to get there? The truth is, we're never there. We're always here. And when we get there, we're still here. There's a stake in a title of a book on Buddhism in the U.S. Wherever you go, there you are. You're still you've got the same people. You're still, you never get there. And that's shouldn't be a point of discouragement. It doesn't mean you don't work for positive change. But again, that linear story that you're going to get to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and then things are going to be right. Some people argue that might have some kind of inspirational value. I guess thinking of some utopia might get some people moving. But I think as anything beyond that is actually quite dangerous, because it is that linear story of we're going to get there and then we can relax. And I mean, thinking of things like racial relations in the U.S., yes, we did finally elect an African-American president, and then we've got all the cases in Missouri and elsewhere about police brutality and unarmed young black men. We're not over the hill. There's been a sea change recently in the U.S. about gay marriage. Actually, that's happened a little bit faster than some people thought it would in terms of some of the conservative states. So things move fast, move slow, things do change. But this idea of a utopia, and you mentioned a little bit about, we've got this, there's a story that that men have are destroying the world. We've got climate change, we have capitalism, all of this evil stuff. And we need to get a utopia that's all local, collective, non-capitalist, etc. I think that's another dangerous story, and it actually feeds right into that gender binary I was talking about. It says where we are now is evil, and we need to somehow make this jump over into utopia.
To the opposite.
Yeah. If you go back to what I was saying before, I think a lot of what we think about, we've allowed capitalism to go down sort of its worst possible road by believing that people have no choice but to be opportunistic and selfish. Okay. There are older and alternative traditions in which you can actually use markets and business to do more than just maximize profit. That phrase, maximizing profit, was invented by economists. It was not invented by business people. There are a lot of people who go into business because they want to make good products, because they want to innovate, because they want to create employment. So if we can get out of the economistic mode of thinking of business as being narrowly about profits, we can think about how business, as other institutions, should be serving human good, and then start from where we are to try to make progress on things like climate change as well as gender issues.
And that kind of economy would not be male or female, but
it wouldn't be male or female. It wouldn't be it would be neither highly individualistic nor highly. I dislike the word solidarity. It sounds like everybody becomes a brick. In between hyper-individuality and hyper-solidarity, there's people actually relating to each other. And that's, I think, where we need to, where our ground for action is.
Okay, then you might disagree with my next claim, but I would like to hear your take on it anyway, because recently I had a conversation with one of my friends, and she asked me, in my opinion, what's the biggest problem within gender struggles? What's the most urgent thing to take care of? And without hesitation, I said rape and rape culture, because it's such a widespread problem, and it's so and it spreads out into all kinds of other areas of problems. And then after we had this talk, I was thinking, maybe it's actually more than that, because I was thinking, what's at the core of rape culture? A culture that based on sexual assault. At the core of that is some men's feeling of entitlement to have what they want, and if they can't have it, then to just take it. And that same mentality is what we see in capitalism, imperialism, war, and it's the same mentality that's led to this overconsumption that is destroying the planet. So I was thinking, maybe rape culture is not the biggest problem within gender struggles, but the biggest problem, period. What would it's just a hypothesis. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that there's a whole, I would put the rape culture aspect under a bigger umbrella, which is about what I think was as a dynamic of control. That I need to be in control of what's going on, because otherwise I'm personally very threatened. I mean, I think the dynamic of control comes out of fear. It comes out of not trusting that the world and people around me are friendly enough to allow me to back off that. And rape culture, domestic violence, or even domestic psychological abuse. I mean, it's all about control. It's all about keeping another person in line. And then there's physical violence, rape violence comes out of that. But also, I think a lot of that. You can have bosses in workplaces that are into a dynamic of control, and you have bullying, and you have oppression of other kinds going on. So I would say yes, rape and violence are big issues. But also, if you have employment relations that don't allow people to make a living wage, that's also a form of economic violence. Okay, that can be seen as coming out of some of this same dynamic. So I would say, yes, that's important. I would put under somewhat more general umbrella phenomenon.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, no, only that I think it's always a danger to oversimplify the world.
Okay.
Because if you take any one of those things that you mentioned, and really begin to analyze it in depth, which I haven't, I'm sure that you're going to find sort of more subtle dynamics that are not equivalent at all these different levels, and that would then dictate that you have different interventions. So if you're trying to change them, if you make that sort of broad sweep, I think it probably becomes very difficult to intervene anywhere. I think you've created a blank wall where you want to have stones that you can gain purchase on and start pulling out. So I think overgeneralization usually is just not helpful.
Okay, so it's not a good theory.
Good. Which you knew.
Good. So, and you talked about...
If I could just add one thing on that. You brought up climate change and these kinds of things, but that a lot of that comes out, when I talked about dynamic of control, the idea behind one particular image of science that's been very popular is that the world is essentially a machine that we can analyze through mathematics and control and use for human ends. In that desire, and there's great quotes from early science about bringing nature to you to make her your slave. I think that was Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
And that sort of attitude towards nature of we have to control nature, and now we have the tools by which we can control nature. Well, nature is biting back. Right. Okay, we have forgotten that this is a powerful and complex entity that is not a simple clockwork that we are able to use to just protect ourselves.
Good. So I want to ask something here, because you said you came out of an activist mindset, so you could say, like I do, and you were working with feminist economy, so that's also political. Last week I talked to Danish sociologist Cecilie Nørgaard, who's specializing in gender and the educational system. And she said that to her it's important to separate between opinions and knowledge when we're working with gender. And this may sound obvious, but in the Danish context it's very common that when you're talking about gender, you're talking about opinions, and they're mostly based on assumptions and myths, like you were talking about. And then to Cecilie Nørgaard, she said it was important to acknowledge that some people actually know stuff about gender. And so we should maybe base our opinions on that knowledge and not only on assumptions and myths, and that it's important to separate when we're talking about opinions and when we're talking about knowledge. And so my question is, did you both as scientists, let's start with you, Julie, did you go into science with opinions and a political agenda and then look for certain answers to support that? Or did you try and go as neutral and objective as possible to find out something and then base your opinions on that? And is the latter even possible?
Well, it's interesting because when we started putting the words feminist and economics together in one sentence, most economists immediately dismissed it as too subjective and political. That economists are doing neutral knowledge, objective knowledge, and feminists are trying to politicize things. And so, I mean, my first book, first individual book in the year is called Feminism, Objectivity, and Economics. Pointing out that the feminist critique was not that economics was too objective, it was that it was not objective enough. Because you could look at some of the early work, say, on economics in the household, and you can read right out what the economists' assumptions were, that the models were proving, for example, that it made sense for women to specialize and work at home. Because they made less in the market, so the guys should specialize in market work, the women should specialize in the home. Well, why do we get that wage differential in the market? Well, we get it because women specialize in homework, so therefore they get less experience, and so you get this perfect circular argument. And this was accepted by the economics profession as just the way things are. So looking at, it is very difficult. I think making a distinction between opinion and fact is a good one, even though it's very intertwined and shady in practice. At least I am a real social scientist at heart. I do want to see where what data and knowledge can bring. And in my recent work, I've been finding how behavioral economists have been writing their gender stereotypes by really treating data very badly to come up with ideas that women are more risk averse than men, and it's simply not there in the data. But when I go back to the data, I don't go back to the data saying, well, I need to show that women and men are the same, because I think that is just as biased as going out there trying to show Mars versus Venus. So I do. I go there and discuss I do try to look at where the data is. And I'm sure that somebody coming 20 years after me can look back at some of my work and say, oh, she didn't notice she had this assumption. And they'll be right, because it's very difficult to be aware of all of your assumptions. But that doesn't mean that we can't try. And the definition of objectivity, actually, I think I've had one sentence going on here for about 5 minutes. I'll try to put a pin on it. The definition of objectivity that I like a lot better than ones that are based on some individual following a particular method and mathematical reasoning. The real definition of objectivity should be, does your work stand up to larger and more diverse communities? For example, in climate change economics, there's economists that use this model of an omniscient social planner who optimizes a social welfare function. And on the basis of this objective research, they decide that we don't really need to worry about climate change because you put a discount rate on things and basically the future beyond about 100 years disappears. Totally objective, totally, from the models, from the math, Well, think of a future person looking back at this. Are they going to think that this was an objective view? Obviously not. It's the wider community, not some particular method, that should be the way that we check whether we're working with facts or opinion.
That's a good point. But so you've both been talking about accuracy and honesty, for example, in research, to be accurate and be honest to whatever findings you get. And then you've been talking about confirmation bias, also the idea that you have these assumptions that you bring into your research even before you start, and then consciously or subconsciously you look for the right answers. But what do you think about this end?
I think that one of the things that first feminist science studies, so the feminist approaches to science in the very early days, and that included not only active scientists like myself, researchers, but also philosophers of science, historians of science, struggled with this idea of objectivity because it has been so linked to science. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what is meant by objectivity. There's some really wonderful historical work on the rise of the idea of objectivity, which shows how it became established in the world. So there's a classic book now in science studies by two men, actually, Shapin and Schaffer, and it's called Leviathan and the Air Pump, and it's about Thomas Hobbes and Thomas Boyle, who were, 16th century, 15th century. So Boyle was the guy who's often seen as the person who, quote, originated the scientific method, and he did all this early work on gas laws and vacuums, and the point is that in order to show, there was a huge scientific debate in the 16th century about what it was a vacuum. Was it the absence of air? Were there things that you could actually physically pump out of, say, a glass jar to create a vacuum? Or was it something else altogether? So he did all of these experiments in which he had a vacuum pump, and he did things like put a bird singing inside the glass jar, and he pumped out the air and showed that the bird would die. But the way in which it was established as objective in science was by having a group of people observe the experiment. So that was how it became objective fact, was that he had a group of people who were, in the language of that time, called modest witnesses. Any of you who know Donna Haraway's work will know that phrase from the title of one of her books, Modest Witness at, what is it? It's a long, difficult title, but, and here's the point. Women were not qualified, and this is explicit in this literature, to be modest witnesses. So they were excluded from the notion of objectivity because they got upset when the bird died. So they interfered with the process of science by having a viewpoint about killing birds. So and so they could not be relied on to be objective witnesses. They could not be relied on to be the people who validated something as a fact. And so that exclusion of women from science and setting them up in opposition to the notion of objectivity comes from the very dawn of modern science, and it's very explicit. It's not an accident. So when people began researching the history of modern science and the history of the idea of objectivity, it became very clear that gender was embedded in it from the very beginning. So the use of the word objectivity is already a weapon in a movement that had excluded women to begin with. So the idea was the question was how to counter that use of the word while not excluding. And of course, women weren't the only people who could not be modest witnesses. You couldn't have slaves as modest witnesses. There were a whole group of people. Only these white middle-class guys could count as validating a fact. So there was a whole movement, intellectual movement, in the 70s and 80s, mostly from feminist philosophers, who were writing about objectivity and trying to figure out how to reclaim the word in a way that made it more inclusive of different points of view, what they call different standpoints in the world. And so what became standpoint theory was part of a movement to reclaim objectivity, and thus reclaim who could make facts and what facts might count as not as true or false, So, but rather what were better facts and what were not better facts. And so the idea was that facts that covered the realities of the world as seen by a wider diversity of people were better facts than facts that just covered those middle-class nobility in England in the 16th century.
That's really funny and interesting, and it leads very much back to what you've been working with, Julie, with this idea of what's objective economical theory. So we have a few minutes before we involve the audience. So I just have one last question. So it goes back to a little bit of what we've been talking about in the beginning, and especially your research, and with how gender is created and how it's created in this dialogue with the surroundings and the biology and all these different things. So some years ago, some documents were leaked from U.S. Air Force Research Center or something, and they in the mid 90s they've been trying to develop non-lethal chemical weapons, so they could pacify enemy troops without killing them. And one of these weapons was a bomb that they would throw on enemy troops, who would all be men and heterosexual, and the bomb would not contain what bombs normally contain, but something similar to female sex hormones. And these hormones would then go like dust on all the troops, and they would become gay, and so they would start having sex with each other, and they would also become weak and limp-wristed. And this is not, and this is, the Pentagon have confirmed that this has been going on. This is not, it's not a hoax, it's not a conspiracy theory. It didn't happen, but they were working on it. So it sounds like something from Donald Duck or gay porn, but
I'd love to have you. I'd love to have you send me the reference for that.
Yeah, I can send you news footage from CBS 5. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd like to track that.
So I would want to hear your opinion. Is that possible?
Well, so no.
Okay.
And I mean, as you know, I mean, the number of different wrong assumptions that are woven into that. I mean, to unpack that seriously, starting from what the concept of gay men is, from the idea that there are no gay men in the army, to the idea that gayness is caused by estrogen. I mean, these are all ideas that no serious person thinks is right. So.
Okay.
So I mean, it almost doesn't dignify a response, I guess.
Okay. But it would just be,
that's not to you, but to the whoever.
But if it was possible, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea anyway. They could throw it on both sides.
Right, from the 60s, make love, not war. I mean.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's all my questions. So should we involve the audience
yes,
now?
Please.
Or is there something
Absolutely.
else? Good. So we have about half an hour, and I'll facilitate the questions.
And I think, like, if anybody wants to ask in Danish, I'm happy to try to translate. This might be, more comfortable to ask in Danish.
Good. There are a few. Yeah.
Julie had some very good points yesterday about statistics and about how a statement like women are more risk averse than men, for example, is really based on results from research that doesn't mean that at all. I think that's a very important thing to talk about, and I was wondering, do you have any ideas to how we actually prevent like the public or the majority of people from getting wrong information this way? I mean, is there a way of making sure that the information that reaches the public is accurate enough for to convince things like this?
It's a difficult situation because there's various levels there. The area I've been most concerned with is economists and social scientists ourselves, that we should not be putting this stuff out. And economists are extremely naive on issues of gender, I would say overall, and have spewed out these blanket statements about women are more altruistic, less competitive, less risk averse, and really, not understanding at all. There was a mention of confirmation bias. A lot of the economists doing this work believe that there is some essential difference between men and women, some Mars versus Venus difference, and that is it's like they wrote their conclusion before they did their research. There's so little evidence there, but yet they make these blanket statements. So, I guess the part I've been most active on is trying to convince my fellow researchers to actually do research and make claims based on research, which I know is revolutionary. But then there's the other issue of translation into media issues, and that's a matter of journalism's being responsible, and of course journalists are under a whole other set of pressures from readership and editors and the rest of this. I've been trying to experiment a little bit more with ways of conveying statistics in ways that are more approachable than what the researchers do. So for example, the North Dakota, South Dakota metaphor, I think, is an easier way of getting at this. Or, for example, some of the literature on women's risk aversion. They say women are more risk averse than men. Well, what would that mean if you selected a man at random and a woman at random? What is the chance that the woman would be more risk averse than the man? Okay. If there was no difference, the chance would be 50-50. Okay. The difference they find makes it like 56% chance. We're not talking about a 90% or 100% chance here. We're talking about this little increment that they found that gets into this blanket statement. But the issue of accurate reporting on scientific and social scientific work in the media is a lot bigger than I can address.
I think we're in a remarkable period in terms of the existence of social media, which everyone in this room has access to. So you can write something that counters it and put it up on a blog, you can tweet it, you can have a Facebook page devoted to myths of economics. Seriously, any particular area that you have, it's no longer true that you have to hope that some newspaper editor will come and interview you about something, or a writer. You can just put it out there. And maybe the audience is small to begin with, but there are ways to spread it. So the newspapers and writers and editors no longer hold all the power in terms of getting different ideas out into the public. And everyone in this room could have a blog about gender and specialize in some area, and once a month put up a post and develop an audience. And you can do it on, with WordPress or Facebook, or if you're less long-winded like I am, you can use Twitter. It's only 140 characters. There are many different ways to change this situation now. It's kind of a remarkable period. It's a little bit like the Wild West out there in that internet universe, but still, it's an opportunity to really get different kinds of information out there, to change discourses that didn't exist 20 years ago.
And you're both active on your blog and on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I also know some people in the audience are using those media.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. There was a question there in the middle. Yeah.
I'm one of those people who occasionally have blogs where it occasionally said something about gender, and I've gotten in 1 year look on sexuality and on gender through social media, so I'm one of these people and I'm very thankful for it. But I'm also a big fan of your work, and especially your excuse the language, but the bullshit dichotomy between nature and nurture, and how it's actually more intertwined. But I just the whole false dichotomy between nature and nurture, it's just so ingrained in the culture. But the fact that it's more of a feedback loop. How do you think that we can try to gain a broader understanding of this? Because by giving a broader understanding of that, we automatically get broader and more nuanced understanding about things like gender. So I just want to know what your take on how we can sort of try to implement that, because it is like the whole essentialist constructivist debate
Right.
is so fraught with things like trying to find a bridge between them is really hard and
So-
impossible.
Yeah, so I think one of the things you have to do is say it over and over and over again. I spent some time thinking about how certain academics gain the majority voice in a field, and one of the people, some of you will know the work of John Money, who was a sexologist from the US who worked on intersex in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and he came to control the discourse about what could be said. Literally, you couldn't get something published if John Money didn't agree, because he was on every editorial board and he published everywhere. And one of the things I realized in looking at his publication is he kind of published the same thing over and over and over again all the time. He went to a meeting, he'd bring the paper, it would get published. He'd publish it in different journals. And so he had this incredible length of publications, which many of which were kind of not very different one from the other. But by sheer repetition, he became, for a long time, the only voice on the topic, and there was no way around it. So one of the things about changing discourse is that you do have to be repetitive. You can't just go out there once and say, no, it's not this way, it's this way. But you have to say that every time. I get a lot of phone calls from reporters who want me to comment on a new paper that's out that says it's 30% genetic and 70% something else. And one of the things I do in talking to any reporter is I refuse to engage with that language. So the first thing I'll say is, that's not the right way to look at it. And they'll say, oh, what is? And I'll try to explain a more dynamic view, which they may or may not understand. But I've refused to engage with the nature-nurture construct of the question. And instead, anybody who comes to me, I say, it's the wrong way to look at the problem. So that's one thing to do, but you have to say it over and over and over again. The other is to try to continue to come up with better ways, like your North Dakota, South Dakota metaphor, better ways. So it's not enough to say this is bad. You also have to have a lot of good sound bites to say, well, here's a good way to think about it. And that takes practice and experiment, and sometimes you try something and it doesn't work. But changing the actual discourse, the language of discourse at a broad cultural level is a slow process. But again, it requires persistence. It requires different kinds of media. Maybe there's someone in the audience who's a good cartoonist. I mean, cartoon novels are a big thing right now, or comic narratives are a big thing right now. So maybe there's someone in here who can do this through comic books or through a comic narrative instead of a word narrative. So you have to just keep at it and try it over and over again in as many different venues. And when people come to you with the nature-nurture construct, you have to not engage with them about that, but you have to say, you have to insist that they leave that language at the doorstep and consider this other language.
Can I just add a story to that? Because there was a so-called scientist in the 50s and 60s here in Denmark called Jens Jersild, who was at the time the big expert on homosexuality, and he was used as a consultant both for making laws and for the educational system and for making feature films. Huh. But where he got his research material was that he was also the head of police. So his research objects were homosexuals that he arrested. So they were often either clients by male sex workers or the male sex workers themselves. So all of his research objects were people who were already in trouble with the law and were giving him the research information under that term. So that goes into a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. Yes, you?
Hey, I was studying anthropology myself, and I'm not so worried about the objectivity part because I think in my field they are more concerned about. We know we are subjects, or everybody is subjects, and whenever you write something, you have that in mind. But I'm very worried about. I want to produce work that melts down these terrible boxes and make the world a better place, but I still want to talk about gender inequality and trans issues and all these kind of things, and I'm worried about empowering these structures by talking about them. And I don't know when the point is going to be that we can stop talking about them because it's gone better. Do you follow?
I think there's a great deal of range for strategic use of concepts that are, if taken as truth, very limiting. That is, you may, in the work that I've done critiquing the stuff in behavioral economics, I've taken a male-female binary because that's what they use in this research. Do I believe that there's a simple male-female binary? No. But in order to, if I were to spend a page explaining this at the beginning of the research, they would never get to the critique because there's times when you need to stop the discourse at the door and say, no, I'm not going to deal, with nature nurture, or I'm not going to deal with male female. But I think there are also times strategically when you need to use the categories, and that's a judgment call. I disagree with people who believe that you can never use, sort of the tools of the master thing. I think sometimes you do have to.
But let me just add, I don't know what your specific concerns are, but there is a lot of there's some, I think, really foundational work on out of anthropology. You probably know Don Kulik's work, Travesti. There's some really great books that really address questions of gender. That particular book is from a field study he did on transsexuals or transgender people in Brazil. Kulik, K-U-L-I-C-K. You should read this book. It's a great example of addressing questions of gender as a cultural anthropologist through field work with a particular group of subjects that obviously he lived with and did all the standard ethnographic things with. And it's a very subtle account of gender. So I think it adds to books like that, work like that, add to a more complex understanding of gender, lived gender in the world. So I think anthropology is actually a great place to be doing that from. But I understand what you're saying, that sometimes you don't want to just keep repeating the discourse because it reinforces it. But I think that there's some kinds of ethnographic work within anthropology which really undermine the discourse.
Yeah, you?
Yes, you talked about both the effect of social media and what you can use that for, and you talked about the rising tide of a reactionary movement in the US, and that's something we see on social media too. Social media is the Ferguson crisis would probably never have surviving for so long in the public discourse without social media. But on the other hand, you see things like revenge porn, and that's designed to target feminists and women who speak up against sexism or whatever a particular man is attached to in this case, and I was wondering if you think there's a way to combat that without obviously delving into censorship, if there's a way to combat this reactionary attitude, and perhaps to find out what the motivations are behind it, if it's revenge or if it's its own movement.
So, 2 points to that. This is an example where I think ignoring them is the best, and putting out your own positive material is the best approach. So, So there is, to combat them by directly taking them on, I just think it's a waste of energy. And there I think it feeds their frenzy. So the good thing about social media is that anyone can get into it. That's also the bad thing about social media, right? Because, as you say, all sorts of people can get into it who are not nice people. So I think the best approach is just to pretend they don't exist, because they require the reaction in order to get their publicity. So don't give it to them. It's like when I get flamed on a tweet that I've put out, something really nasty comes across, I never respond to it. I never acknowledge it. And it just stops right there, because it requires me saying something to then have the person's 5 other friends then jump in and get nasty. And by far the better thing to do is to ignore it. But on the other hand, the other piece of what you said is, where does it come from? Now that's something an anthropologist could try to study, which is, who are the people who are putting out this work on the internet? Sometimes you know who they are, sometimes you don't. They make up names. What I've noticed in the really nasty anti-feminist stuff that I see online is that it's often if you go and look at their Twitter account, they have like 5 followers. It's some lonely person somewhere who's just, unhappy in the world, and is kind of striking out. But that would be a really interesting ethnographic problem for an anthropology student to follow up, to say, who are these people, where are they coming from, what motivates them? And that would also bring it out into the light in an academic setting that would also, expose what's going on in certain ways. So maybe that's your thesis.
I wanted to mention, there's an interesting case been going on in the U.S. just in the last couple of weeks. Kurt Schilling, who was a Red Sox pitcher, famous guy, his daughter was on some kind of sports team or something like that, and got rape threats, kind of really obscene things coming in over social media. And as a pissed off father, he found out who 2 of these people were and revealed their identities. And one of them had been like an editor of a university newspaper and is now suspended or something like that. But there is, there's the ignore it part, but you can also, I think, if you are being somebody trying to victimize you with that can also feel alone. And so I think groups like, Men Against Rape and that kind of thing are also important in combating this kind of thing. And if it takes a pissed off, superstar father to bring some attention to it, I think it's an interesting case. I mean, there were problems with that as well, but I think it's an interesting case if you're interested in social media.
Julie, you said earlier that beliefs about gender is binary matter, but it's also important for how we structure the world. And I find that sometimes when people listen to feminist critique on the gender assumptions, then their reaction is, oh, this is just harmful political correctness, which will confuse people even more and make it even more difficult to find a certain identity and know who you are as a person. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm not sure I answer your question, but I have to say that I do disagree with some aspects of feminist theory that I think have gone too far into the I guess relativism might be one word for it, or too far into avoiding categories to the point where you can't use a category for political purposes. I think that becomes a difficulty. If you say we can't organize, a women something because we can't define a category of women, I think that's getting to a point where our sophistication about categories might actually be getting in the way of some positive actions, and we need to weigh off how much we want to be kind of precise and inclusive and how much we want to be effective. Unfortunately, they're not always the same thing, and that is a judgment area.
Yes?
Well, first of all, thank you for some very interesting insights from all 3 of you. I just want to comment quickly on the troll part and say that
people are more interested in that. There's recently been this podcast from This American Life where someone actually goes after her troll and finds him and reconciles and he apologizes. So there might also be some very positive outcomes of not ignoring the trolls. But my question is something completely different, and it's mainly to Julie, but please feel free to comment also. I was wondering if you have any opinions or insight about this tendency, I think you can call it a tendency at least, to talk about how now when looking at third world countries, we need to really get the women into the economy, and if we invest in women, we're going to be investing in the whole society, and this sort of also very binary thinking about economy that's prevalent in some more recent work, and also from some NGOs who are trying to better some societies. I was wondering if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real mixed bag. In some ways, it can really count as a success, at least compared to development economics when I studied in the 1970s. At that point, there were development projects that were like giving farming information to men when it was the women that did the farming. I mean, it was just kind of, gender was not in there. So gender has, I would say that feminist work and work on gender has made its most strides within economics in the area of development. And there has been a recognition that countries don't advance in production and that kind of thing if you leave out half the people and you don't educate the girls. So there's been some advances there. On the other hand, there's also been obvious co-optation and obvious use of women as instruments for something else rather than treating the women as beings whose well-being is interesting in their own right. And there have been some partnerships between NGOs and, say, some of the large multinational banks it's phrased in empowering women by bringing them into the financial system and allowing them access to credit. Or you could look at it as getting women into debt slavery like the rest of the world so that the banks can control them, I mean, there, I think, are some aspects of both in those. And I would hesitate to say it's all, roses and daisies or all evil empire. But it's a very complicated situation, I would say. And there definitely are some darker aspects to some of the targeting of women in development projects.
We have time for one last question. Otherwise, I also have one, but I've already been asking a lot. Okay, I'll ask them. And it's about to what you said before, and but Julia also free to answer. But it's about the whole trolling thing, and you said that then when you look at these people who write these comments, often they're just sad and lonely people, and that's also my impression. Sometimes it's editors of university papers, but
they can also be sad and lonely.
Yeah, of course. But it's true, and it's also my experience with hate crimes, for example. A lot of times, these people doing these things are people who are just really sad and lonely and just have really bad lives themselves. But how does that work together with the fact that we still have structural oppression and we still have like a sad and lonely man oppressing or like harassing a woman? How do we work that when the hierarchies are so complex? And do you have any thoughts on that?
No, it's a great question. And I don't really have any thoughts on it, except that I think they're related. In other words, I think we have, as long as we have, and I guess we will for the rest of my lifetime, a culture in which not everybody has a good life. And some of the people who don't have good lives have access to these negative discourses, then there will be people at the fringes who will have negative responses to the world. I think the better everyone's life is, maybe the less often that will happen. I doubt it will ever disappear. There's too much variability in the human population to think that, to think that there would be a utopia in which no one would take up the role of the troll in the in the internet equivalent of whatever future we have. But I do think that they're related in the sense that that it's likely that people who cannot achieve the quote ideal of masculinity themselves may then take that out on other people who've actually rejected the norm of masculinity in their own lives. So I mean, I do think that the gender, to the extent that gender constructs become boxes that people are trapped in, there are people who will respond negatively to being in that trap, especially if they can't achieve what's supposed to be achieved. You know, if they're not the star football player and they don't get the pretty girl and they, you know, all of those sorts of things. I mean, there's enough human variation that there will always be people who are sort of stuck in their lives, and they may take it out on other people.
And they can't even cry about it because it's unmasculine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said earlier, but I think the dynamic of control fundamentally comes out of fear. Mm-hmm. And that people who feel like they need to control things are fundamentally coming at that from a point of weakness. What I see as the most hopeful bridge there is in the philosophy of nonviolence, to work with all your might to change an unjust situation and also completely reject objectifying and dehumanizing your opponent in the process.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the way to go.
Good. I think that will be the last words. So I hope that everybody got some gasoline for their fire, and that
excellent.
That we can go out and change the world, and in each our different field. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Mats. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.